My dad, James, has always been a man who believed the world owed him something. He wasn't always like that, not when I was a kid. Back then, he was the fun, charming guy who would pick me up after school with a big smile and an even bigger ice cream cone. But over the years, his charm soured into entitlement, and his expectations grew heavier with each passing day. My mom, bless her soul, did her best to balance his indulgences, but after she passed away when I was 19, something inside him changed. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to just have a comfortable life. He wanted luxury, and for some reason, he decided I was going to provide it for him. I'm Emily, by the way. I'm 32 years old, and after years of working my way up in the finance industry, I finally have a stable job, my own condo, and a life I'm proud of. I've worked for everything I have, and I've done it without help. That's the thing about my dad. He's always been the type to take, but never give. Growing up, I learned early on that my needs came second to his desires. When I wanted piano lessons, Dad said we couldn't afford it, but the very next month, he bought himself a brand new entertainment system to help him unwind after work. When I mentioned college, he laughed and told me community college was more realistic, all while planning his dream vacation to Europe. I put myself through school, working late shifts at a diner while studying finance during every spare moment. I thought he'd be proud of me. Instead, he barely acknowledged my efforts. "It's good you're working hard, Em," he'd say, in his usual nonchalant tone, "because not everyone gets lucky like your old man." Lucky. Right. He called living off of my mom's life insurance and blowing it on flashy cars and weekend getaways luck. For years, I tried to play the dutiful daughter. I'd visit him every Sunday, bring groceries, pay for little things here and there, his phone bill, his insurance premiums, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he'd appreciate it. But appreciation was never his strong suit. He always wanted more. The turning point came when he announced his retirement plans. I remember it vividly. We were sitting in his cluttered living room, the TV blaring some rerun of an old sitcom he never seemed to tire of. "I'm thinking it's time I really enjoy life," he said, leaning back in his recliner with a satisfied grin. "I've been looking into this month-long luxury cruise. You know, those fancy ones with the all-you-can-eat buffets, exotic locations, the whole deal." I smiled, assuming he was just dreaming out loud. "Sounds amazing, Dad. You deserve it." His grin widened, and that's when I should have known what was coming next. "Yeah, so I figured, since you're doing so well now, you could cover it. It's not much, really. 25 grand, give or take." I blinked. "Wait, you want me to pay for it?" He waved a hand dismissively. "Come on, Em. You're making good money. I didn't ask for much when you were growing up. This is just a little thing." A little thing? $25,000? For a cruise? I felt the air shift between us, a familiar weight settling in my chest. "Dad," I started carefully, "I can't afford that. I have my own responsibilities, my mortgage, my car payments, my savings. I can't just—" He cut me off with a scoff. "Responsibilities? What responsibilities? You don't have a family. You're single, living alone. What are you even saving for?" His words stung more than they should have. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced myself to stay calm. "I'm saving for my future, Dad. For things I want. I can't just drop that kind of money on." And then came the part that really got me. He sighed, shook his head, and muttered, "You know, you're so selfish sometimes, Em, after everything I've done for you." I sat there, stunned. Everything he had done for me? Like what? Offering vague encouragement from the sidelines while I fought tooth and nail for everything I have? Blowing through the money Mom left behind without a second thought? I left his house that evening feeling something shift inside me, an exhaustion that went beyond the usual disappointment. It was like a dam breaking, letting years of resentment flood in all at once. Dad had always assumed that because I loved him, I'd always be there to bail him out, no questions asked. But for the first time, I started to wonder what would happen if I just said no. I didn't hear from my dad for a few weeks after that conversation, and honestly, I enjoyed the silence. No guilt trips, no passive-aggressive comments, just peace. But of course, that couldn't last forever. It started with little things, missed calls, vague text messages. "Hey, kid, let's talk." Or "M, we need to clear the air." Each one carefully worded to sound innocent, but I knew better. He wanted something, and I wasn't in a hurry to give it to him. Eventually, he gave up on subtlety and showed up at my condo unannounced. I was in the middle of a Zoom meeting when I heard the insistent knocking at my door. I muted myself, peeked through the peephole, and sighed. There he was, standing there with his usual self-important stance, like he owned the place. I opened the door a crack. "Dad, I'm working." He grinned like nothing had happened. "You're always working, Em. Can't you take a break for your old man?" I should have shut the door right then and there, but some part of me, maybe habit, maybe guilt, let him in. He walked straight to my couch and plopped down like he belonged there, looking around like he was appraising the place. "Nice. I see your job's treating you well." I sat across from him, arms crossed. "What do you want, Dad?" His face darkened, the easygoing act dropping like a mask. "I was thinking about what you said, about how you're saving for your future and all." I braced myself. "And well, I get it," he continued. "You've got your life to think about, but so do I, Em. Retirement's not cheap, and I don't have much left in savings. You know, your mother always said we'd take care of each other." I clenched my jaw. "You took care of yourself, Dad. Mom took care of us. There's a difference." His eyes narrowed, but he waved it off like it didn't matter. "Look, I'll be straight with you. I need some help. Not for the cruise, forget about that, but, things are getting a little tight." Tight? Right. Translation: I blew through my savings and I need a bailout. I sighed, rubbing my temples. "Dad, I can't just hand you money whenever you run into trouble." "You're my daughter," he shot back, a flash of irritation breaking through his voice. "That's what family does, Em." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Family helps each other, yes, but it's supposed to be mutual. When have you ever been there for me when I needed help? That hit a nerve. His face flushed, but instead of admitting anything, he switched tactics. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Just because you've got some fancy job in a condo. You forget I raised you." I stood up, pointing to the door. "You didn't raise me, Dad. Mom did. And if you're just here to guilt trip me, you can leave." He stood too, his face hardening into something colder, angrier. "Fine. Be selfish, Emily, but don't come crying to me when you end up alone." I didn't respond. I just held the door open and waited. After a few tense seconds, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The escalation. A few days later, I got a call from Aunt Carol, my dad's older sister. We weren't particularly close, so I was surprised to hear from her. "Honey, your dad's in a tough spot," she started, her voice dripping with that forced concern that always annoyed me. "He told me what happened between you two." I rolled my eyes. "Did he tell you he asked me to drop 25 grand on a cruise?" She paused. "Well, no, but—" I cut her off. "Then he didn't tell you the full story, did he?" She sighed dramatically. "Emily, you know he doesn't have much left. And he's family. It's your responsibility to help him." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Aunt Carol, he's a grown man who's made his own choices. Why am I suddenly responsible for fixing his mistakes?" She hesitated, and I knew she didn't have an answer. "Just think about it," she said before hanging up. It didn't stop there. Suddenly, distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years were reaching out. Cousins, uncles, even some of my dad's old buddies. They all had the same message. "Why aren't you helping your dad?" It was like he'd launched a full-scale PR campaign against me. I blocked numbers. I ignored messages. But the damage was done. Every call chipped away at me, making me question if I was being too harsh, too stubborn. Then, one night, I saw something that made my blood boil. I was scrolling through social media when I stumbled across a post from my dad. It was a long, self-pitying rant about how his only daughter had abandoned him in his time of need and how he'd given up everything to give me a good life. The comments were flooded with sympathy. "You deserve better, Jim. Some kids forget who raised them. She'll regret it when you're gone." I stared at the screen, shaking with anger. He was playing the victim perfectly, twisting reality to make himself look like the martyr and me like the ungrateful villain. I knew then that I couldn't just sit back and let him control the narrative. Taking control, I started small, letting people know the truth, quietly but firmly. When relatives reached out, I told them exactly what had happened, how my dad had squandered his savings and expected me to clean up the mess. Some listened, others didn't, but I could feel the tide turning. Then, one day, I got a call from my dad himself. His voice was subdued, almost cautious. "Hey, kid, maybe I went too far with all that social media stuff." I stayed silent. He sighed heavily. "Look, I just thought you'd understand, that you'd want to help me." I exhaled slowly. "I have helped you, Dad, over and over, but you don't get to guilt me into bankrupting myself for you." He didn't argue. For once, he just listened. "Maybe it's time you figured things out for yourself," I added. "You're not my responsibility." There was a long pause, and then he muttered, "Yeah, maybe." It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. For the first time in years, I felt like I was reclaiming control, not just of my finances, but of my life. A few weeks passed without a word from my dad. It was quiet, too quiet. After the social media post and the family guilt-tripping, I expected him to keep pushing, but instead, he disappeared. No texts, no calls, nothing. At first, I felt relief, like I had finally won, but deep down, I knew better. My dad never walked away empty-handed, and then, just as I was starting to let my guard down, he came back in full force. I was at work when I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick up. "Emily, it's your dad." His voice sounded different, strained, maybe even desperate. I sighed. "What do you want, Dad?" "Listen, I need to see you. It's important." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to hang up, but curiosity got the better of me. "Fine, but I'm not giving you money." "I just need to talk," he said, and then he hung up before I could change my mind. I agreed to meet him at a local diner, the same place he used to take me as a kid when things were simpler, when he actually cared, or at least pretended to. When I walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked worn out, thinner than before, and there was no bravado in his eyes. Just exhaustion. I sat down across from him, arms crossed. "All right, talk." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, rubbing his hands together. "Emily, I messed up." I stared at him, waiting. "Yeah, you did." He swallowed hard. I lost everything." His voice cracked slightly, but I wasn't sure if it was genuine or another performance. "The house is gone. The car. I borrowed money thinking I could pay it back, but it got out of hand." I leaned back in my chair, my chest tightening. "And you thought I'd bail you out again?" He shook his head quickly. No. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I blinked. That was unexpected. "I shouldn't have asked you for that cruise," he continued. "I shouldn't have expected you to fix everything. I don't know how to live without someone taking care of me." That was probably the most honest thing he had ever said. I wanted to feel sorry for him. I really did. But years of manipulation and emotional blackmail had hardened me. "Dad," I said quietly, "I love you, but I can't keep doing this." He looked up, eyes pleading. I know. I'm not asking you to." Liar. I pulled out a folded piece of paper from my bag and slid it across the table. "Here. I found you a few affordable apartments that offer financial assistance. You'll have to work, but it's a start." He stared at the paper like it was a foreign object. You're not going to help me?" "I am helping you," I said firmly. "I'm helping you help yourself." His jaw clenched. So that's it? You're just gonna let your old man rot? I sighed, shaking my head. No, Dad. I'm giving you the tools to stand on your own feet, something you should have done a long time ago. For a moment, I thought he might actually take it. I saw the gears turning in his head, the weight of his reality settling in. But then, just like that, the old James came back. He shoved the paper aside, his face darkening. You think you're better than me, don't you? Sitting there in your fancy clothes, acting like you've got it all figured out. I felt a pang of disappointment, but not surprise. No, Dad. I just grew up. He scoffed, standing up abruptly. Well, don't come crying to me when you realize money can't buy happiness, Emily. I met his gaze, my voice steady. I don't need money to buy happiness, Dad. I just need peace. He walked out of the diner, and for the first time in my life, I let him go without chasing after him. The turning point. A week later, I got another call. This time, it wasn't him. It was Aunt Carol. Emily, your dad's been staying on my couch. He's not doing well? I closed my eyes, feeling that familiar guilt creeping back in. I gave him options, Carol. He didn't want them. She sighed. I know, but he's finally ready to listen. I hesitated, my heart battling my mind. Can you just talk to him one more time? She asked. Reluctantly, I agreed. When I arrived at Carol's, Dad looked even worse than before. He didn't say much, just nodded when I walked in. Carol gave us space, and for a long moment, we sat in silence. Finally, he cleared his throat. I looked at those apartments you gave me. I arched a brow. Yeah? He nodded slowly. They're not bad. I almost smiled. No, they're not. I think I'm going to give it a shot, he mumbled. It's not going to be easy, but maybe you're right. Maybe I need to figure things out. Relief washed over me, but I kept my voice even. I'm proud of you, Dad. He chuckled dryly. First time for everything, huh? That night, I left Carol's house feeling something I hadn't felt in years, Hope. Maybe he would actually change this time. Maybe not. But I knew one thing for sure. I had done all I could. The rest was up to him. It's been 6 months since that night at Aunt Carol's, and life has been peaceful. Dad ended up moving into one of the affordable apartments I found for him. I helped him fill out the paperwork, but after that, I made it clear. This was his responsibility now. No more bailouts, no more rescues. He had to figure it out on his own. At first, he resisted, of course. There were plenty of half-hearted attempts to reel me back in texts about how tough it was, calls about how the neighbors were too loud, or the job he found at the hardware store was beneath him. Each time, I reminded him that he had options and left it at that. Eventually, the complaints slowed and something amazing happened. He started to take care of himself. I heard from Carol that he was showing up to work regularly, even making friends with some of his coworkers. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't relying on someone else to pay his way. One afternoon, I got a text from him that simply said, "Thanks, Em, for not giving up on me." It wasn't much, but it meant everything. As for me, I finally started focusing on the things that mattered. With the weight of his expectations off my shoulders, I poured myself into my career and even started dating again, something I hadn't had the emotional bandwidth for in years. I took a trip to Europe, the one I had always dreamed about but never prioritized, because I was too busy worrying about Dad. Walking through the streets of Paris, sipping coffee at a little cafe near the Seine, I realized something. I had spent so much of my life trying to be the daughter he wanted that I forgot to be the woman I wanted to be. And I liked her. Not long after I got back, Dad invited me to dinner at his new place. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I accepted. When I arrived, I was surprised to see the place was decent. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, modest, and most shocking of all, comfortable. He'd even cooked. Spaghetti, his old standby. I had to Google half the ingredients, he admitted sheepishly, scratching the back of his head. But it's edible. I laughed, sitting down at the small table. Looks good, Dad. Over dinner, we talked. Not about money, not about responsibilities, but about life. He told me about the regular customers at his store, how he was trying to budget better, and even mentioned signing up for a financial literacy course. I could tell he was still getting used to standing on his own, but for the first time in years, I saw something in him I hadn't seen before: humility. Before I left, he hesitated at the door. Listen, Em. He cleared his throat. I know I wasn't the best dad. I let you down a lot, but I hope you know I'm trying. I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. I know, Dad. And for once, I actually believed it. Walking to my car, I realized that while things would never be perfect between us, they didn't have to be. I had set my boundaries, and he had finally started respecting them. And that was enough. A year later, I stood in my kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Dad. Got promoted to floor manager today. Can't believe it. Dinner to celebrate? I smiled, shaking my head. A year ago, the thought of him holding down a job, let alone getting promoted, would have been laughable. But here we were. Congrats, Dad. Let's do it, I texted back. As I set my phone down, I realized how much had changed, not just with him, but with me. I no longer felt the crushing weight of responsibility for his choices. I had my own life now, friends, hobbies, even a new relationship that wasn't built on fixing someone. Dad was learning to stand on his own, and so was I. Later that night, as we clinked our glasses at dinner, he grinned. I guess you were right, Em. I smirked. I usually am. We both laughed, and for the first time in a long time, it felt easy.